Today's talk is titled The Historical Foundation of Buddhism in India, presented by Dr. Aftab S. Hassal. Dr. Hassal is an assistant professor of anthropology at UC San Diego. He is an anthropologist of religion who specializes in the study of South Asian religions, particularly Hinduism. Please help me welcome our presenter for today. Dr. Hassal? Dr. Hassal, please continue. Thank you so much. We're not able to hear you. You possibly might be muted, Dr. Hassal. Also, a reminder for everyone, if you can please show your video during the class, that would be greatly appreciated. And a reminder that we are recording today's session. Thank you.
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and welcome. Thank you, Venerable, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here today. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound coming out all right? This is my first Zoom presentation, so I hope the unseen forces of technology will be kind to us, particularly me today. And I'm going to try to keep things as brief as possible to allow time for discussion at the end of our session. So my talk today is really about the Vedas and the Upanishads in the history and development of Hinduism, and how these two epochs or eras in the intellectual development of Hinduism relate to early Buddhism. So really how the Vedas and the Upanishads relate to early Buddhism. In talking about the Vedas and the Upanishads, this is a very long time period. The Vedas were probably composed sometime around, probably composed around 1800 to 1200 BCE. That's probably when these traditions were started to be compiled. And the Upanishads, the early Upanishads were probably composed closer to 800 BCE. So we already have, sort of a 1,000-year, process of development and maturation of these traditions, and then even further until the rise of Buddhism. So it's quite challenging to think of these extended time periods in a sort of in an overview kind of format. So of course I'll be glossing over many things, but it'll give us a sense of the relationship between early Hinduism and early Buddhism. One moment. So, from an historical perspective, Buddhism arose in the Indian subcontinent with the birth of Prince Siddhartha or Gautama Buddha in what is now North India in the 6th century BCE approximately. Of course, these are the historiographical dating practices of 20th century historians, and Indian, Buddhist, Hindu traditions have a different way of sort of, you know, describing this history. But according to Western historians, around the 6th century BCE is when Gautama Buddha was born in North India. And on this map, you see a number of, you know, locations that are important to Buddhists. And I know several members of your group have traveled to India and are familiar with these places in a more, you know, personal way. So we have on this map Gaya, Bodh Gaya, Nalanda, the site of an amazing university, and the intellectual tradition associated with that university had a sort of a profound global impact, including in Tibet and other parts of the world. In South India as well, you have the site called Nagarjuna Konda, which is in South India. This is where Nagarjuna is is thought to have been born, and that's where he studied. And there are these caves that mark his life there, and of course Ajanta, Ellora, and many other places. So in order to contextualize the revolutionary significance of the Buddha's philosophical and practical interventions, in my talk I'll focus on two interrelated aspects of the broader Indian intellectual tradition, so the Vedas and the Upanishads, and also yoga. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about yoga and Sankhya today, but perhaps we'll have another opportunity to talk about yoga, which is its, you know, and Sankhya philosophy, and you know, the important connection that those have to Buddhism as well. So the Buddha built on these bodies of knowledge, in addition to many others, while also diverging from them in important ways. And perhaps in the Q&A, in our discussion, we'll have a chance to think about these similarities and differences between the Vedas and the Upanishads on one hand, and Buddhism on the other. To give you a broad chronology of ancient Hinduism, so, you know, starting around 1200 BCE, though some scholars say, say it goes even further back to probably 1800 BCE, we have the compilation of texts known as the Vedas, and the Vedic period of Hinduism, or the development of Hindu traditions. And around 800 BCE, the rise of the Upanishads and the Upanishadic period, the two things that we'll be talking about. Alongside the Upanishads, you also have, you know, yoga and Sankhya philosophy. Later, the epic period, from which we know texts like the Bhagavad Gita, which many of you will be familiar with. And then later, the consolidation of Hinduism, much as it's known today in South Asia and other parts of the world. So the rise of the gods Shiva, Vishnu, and the goddess, and sectarian Hinduism in general, and Bhakti devotionalism. But we'll just be talking about the Vedas and the Upanishads. In my talk today, I argue that it was non-materialism that distinguished Upanishadic religion from Vedic religion. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by non-materialism. And yet the Buddha and Buddhism took non-materialism even further by critiquing the very notion of an unchanging, stable self, an Atma, which was one of the philosophical bedrocks of early Hinduism. So uh, let's move on to the Vedas in the interests of, staying on schedule. Um, as I mentioned, they're the most ancient, important scriptures of Hinduism. There are four major Vedas. The most famous is the Rig Veda. These compositions were held to be sacred by a nomadic group of people known as the Aryans. Of course, that the word Aryan will be familiar to us from less palatable contexts in modern European history, and of course in the US as well. There are various groups that are connected to this idea of this kind of pure Aryan heritage. But Arya basically, it means noble one in Sanskrit. And these were some of the earliest inhabitants of South Asia. People, scholars hypothesize that they migrated to South Asia from Central Asia. There were also groups of Aryans who migrated towards Persia or Iran, the Zend Avesta, and the Zoroastrianism is seen as an Indo-European religious tradition. And the language that these Aryans spoke was Sanskrit, which is, again, an Indo-European language, closely connected to Greek and Latin. These Vedas weren't written down for hundreds of years. Rather, they were memorized and passed down orally. So unlike the Hebrew Bible, the 5 books of Moses, which are said to be fixed in writing, the Vedas were fixed in sound. That means that they were memorized, they were passed down orally, and what mattered the most was how they were vocalized. So they could be written down in any script, but they had to be spoken exactly as they had been for generations. Whereas the Hebrew Bible, which is in the Hebrew language, is an interesting sort of comparison, because the texts of the Hebrew Bible were fixed in writing. That means they have to be written down in the exact form in which they were first written. They can be vocalized in different ways, but what's important is the written text rather than the oral tradition. It's a very broad comparison, but I lived in Israel for several years, and I was fascinated by the interesting similarities and differences between Judaism and ancient Hinduism as well. I think the idea of a sacred language and the power of language is something that really connects these two traditions. The Vedas consist of many hundreds and thousands of mantras, which are incantations. These are powerful oral incantations, which were dedicated to Vedic deities, which were often identified with natural phenomena, such as thunder, wind, fire, and so on. So the Vedas as oral traditions, as oral texts, were employed as part of a system of ritual sacrifice, which was thought to guarantee the proper functioning of the world, of the cosmos. These large-scale sacrifices lay at the center of the social, political, economic, and cultural life of Vedic society. They were time-consuming, they were costly, they were highly intricate, and these sacrifices were performed by priests known as Brahmins. So they centered around large fire altars into which priests made various kinds of offerings into the sacred fire. In this way, Vedic people communicated with their gods and ancestors. And this is important. The goal of the sacrifice was really to ensure the material well-being of the community. So they were to guarantee the health, the security, the prosperity of the community. And the person performing the sacrifice was thought to reach heaven. So I'll get to this idea of the materialism and non-materialism of various traditions, but later critiques of Vedic religion were that they were materialistic in that they were designed to ensure the prosperity and well-being of individuals and communities. Unlike in the Upanishads, which we'll talk about shortly, where it was really about achieving release from the cycle of birth and death and suffering. So this is a contemporary performance of Vedic sacrifices. This is a very small fire altar, but there were many different kinds of altars that were used in these sacrifices, and hundreds of people were involved. Each had their own role, and these were very technical sort of procedures. And the rise of astronomy or astrology in India and mathematics and things that became highly developed in the succeeding centuries really came out of the amount of attention and the focus that went into arranging and managing these sacrifices. So these weren't just fire altars, they were seen as models of the cosmos, which means that any action that was done in the sacrificial arena had corresponding effects in the cosmos as a whole. So it was really the engine of the universe, and something that had to be manipulated very precisely in order to ensure that there's a harvest, there's a proper harvest, there's the rain falls on time, the sun rises in the morning, and so on. So the Vedic sacrifice was instrumental in renewing and maintaining order in the universe. Here, order is what is called dharma in the Vedic period. Of course, over the centuries, dharma acquired many other meanings. It means religion, an individual's moral duty, civil law, the moral quality of righteousness, the inherent function and nature of a thing. So you'd say the dharma of the sun is to shine, the dharma of the cow is to give milk, so which is different from saying that the religion of the sun is to shine. Obviously that wouldn't make any sense. In dharma, in Buddhism, later dharma refers more specifically to the teachings of the Buddha. So dharma has a range of important meanings. During the Vedic period, we also saw the rise of what has proven to be a really enduring feature of Indian society, and that is the caste system. So at the top of the hierarchy, you have the priests, then you have the warriors, then you have the farmers and artisans, laborers, and then the outcasts. Women as a social group, as a caste in and of themselves, were classed with the lowest caste in this hierarchy. So it was a very hierarchical and in some ways oppressive social system in certain senses. So many religious sects were highly critical of the caste system. And what we're going to be talking about shortly, the Upanishads, the scholars and sages of the Upanishadic period in the development of Indian religions, were also critical of this model, as was the Buddha, who was also critical of the caste system, and it was one of the important driving forces in the sort of break between Buddhism and Hinduism. But there were, of course, many critiques from within Hinduism as well that were directed against the caste system. So let's turn to the Upanishads. As I said, around 800 BCE onwards, there was a kind of a religious, cultural, social revolution that took place. It transformed the religious landscape of South Asia in many important ways. One of the changes that the Upanishads introduced were to emphasize philosophy over, philosophy, self-realization, renunciation, and so on over Vedic ritualism or sacrifice. So the Upanishads themselves were highly philosophical texts about the nature of being and the relationship between the individual soul and the cosmic universal soul. So Atman or Atma, which is the self, and Brahman, which is the cosmic soul, or the absolute, in the formless, attributeless absolute in this tradition. So one of the really famous formulations of the Upanishads is Aham Brahmasmi, which in Sanskrit means I am Brahman, or I am all, or the self is identical to, or the individual self is identical to the cosmic self. So the Upanishads also contained a critique of Vedic materialism, so this expenditure of time and energy on these sacrificial performances to ensure the proper functioning of the universe. With the Upanishads, we also found an emphasis on terms that became really formative in the subsequent history of religious thought in South Asia and Asia in general, which was the concept of samsara and the karmic cycle of death and rebirth. So karma referred to all kinds of human action which accumulated certain kinds of traces or residues known as vasanas on persons, determining their future birth. Ignorance and attachment were seen to generate suffering and rebirth, both high and low. So whereas in the Vedas, the emphasis was on being reborn in a heavenly realm, so achieving a better form of rebirth, of reincarnation. By the Upanishads, there was this criticism of the very cycle of birth and death itself, including being reborn as a deity or being reborn as, in a heavenly realm with, riches and power and wisdom and all of those things. Even that was suspect in the eyes of the Upanishadic scholars and sages. So what these people recommended was renunciation from worldly life and the renouncing of material possessions. So such renunciants would retire to the forest to meditate and study, and achieve self-realization, which is the discovering the relationship or the identity between the individual soul and the cosmic soul. And the Buddha, too, in his early years, was a product of this tradition of renunciation and yoga and study and meditation and so on, asceticism, as it's sometimes called. And of course, this was partly connected to the rise of urban settlements all across South Asia and a heightening of materialistic worldly values and concerns. So there were these groups of radicals who rejected all of that, rejected these worldly concerns and ties, and retired to the forest to look within. So part of their practice included, the performance of yoga, meditation, and the goal was to achieve moksha or nirvana, release from the cycle of birth and death. So, in a more general sense, I would say the history of Hinduism, the development of Hindu traditions has been a way to reconcile this kind of tension between Vedic values and worldviews, which might be called dharmic values or dharma values, and Upanishadic religion, on the other hand, with what you would call moksha values. So this tension between dharma and moksha was this kind of really generative tension within the development of Hindu traditions. So, in this view, karma, all actions left residues which kept you attached, kept you caught in this web of birth and rebirth. And the goal through yoga and meditation was to achieve release from the cycle of suffering. So what we have in the Upanishads then is an assumption of Atma as an unchanging and constant individual self in relation to Brahman that underlies and is the basis for all human experiences. Moreover, this unchanging self is identified as what we what we essentially are, and what takes us beyond suffering. The early Upanishads themselves acknowledged that the self was something of a mysterious, ungraspable entity. And here is the place where Buddhist thought really laid down its challenge. Perhaps because the nature of the self was acknowledged to be mysterious and ungraspable, maybe it didn't make any coherent sense at all. And that was Buddha's challenge, really. If your notion of self is so, mysterious, then perhaps it doesn't actually correspond to anything real in the world. So thus, Buddhist thought suggests that as an individual, instead of having a kind of unified self, the person is instead a complex flow of physical and mental phenomena. So the 5 aggregates, so bodily phenomena, feelings, conscious awareness, and so on. Once you peel away those phenomena and look behind them, one does not find a constant self that one can call one's own, unlike what the Upanishads proposed. So this was the real break between the Upanishads and early Buddhism. So we can see the similarities, the important similarities between Buddhism and the Upanishads, but we also see an important and foundational break. One moment. So This was the Buddha's critique of self or Atma. For Buddhist thought, to understand the world in terms of self is not only to see it wrongly, but to be led by greed, desire, and attachment. One's sense of self springs not only from delusion, but from the desire to identify and claim or lay claim to some parts of the universe as one's own, as one's possession, and to say that this is mine, I am this is myself. The appropriating of these parts of the universe as mine, as belonging to oneself, um, as opposed to yours, and the desire to construct a self or personal identity according to the Buddha and his followers must inevitably lead to selfish concerns. So selfish, um, you know, an understanding of selfish here, I think, works in two ways. It uh, helps us think about the notion of self and non-self in relation to the Upanishads and also the materialistic bent of early Vedic religion. So to conclude, it was non-materialism that distinguished Upanishadic religion from Vedic religion, and yet the Buddha took this idea of non-materialism even further by critiquing the very notion of an unchanging self. All right, I think I should stop here, and hopefully we have plenty of time for questions and comments and discussions, and thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. We actually ended up with 5 extra minutes of time, so we have a total of 15. So if you have any questions, please just mention your name, since we have 31 participants, and ask your question. Thank you so much.
Hi, this is Carl. Could I ask a question?
Please.
What was the influence of the pre-Aryan people, Dravidian people in South India? What was their influence, if any, on the Hinduism at that time or today?
That's a great question. So the way the story is told in school textbook, and the way people have thought about this was that we had non-Aryan peoples, Dravidian people in South Asia before the coming of the Aryans. It's sometimes described as an invasion of sorts. So in one fell swoop, you had Central Asian nomadic people come into South Asia and and begin to inhabit this territory. In fact, what happened was many waves of migration over centuries, if not millennia, of different groups of nomadic people that are all clubbed together or thought of as one group today, known as the Aryans. In fact, there were many waves of migration, and this wasn't so much an invasion as it was a kind of mixing or an intermingling that took place between the so-called original inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent and the Aryans. So really what the later Aryans encountered were other groups of Aryans who had intermarried with so-called indigenous people. So it becomes really tricky to disaggregate the Dravidian or non-Aryan components from the Aryan components. A lot of scholars have tried, but really all of those things were working together in in a really kind of complicated way. So I would say that the Vedas have as much of a Dravidian sort of input as they do in some ways an Aryan input. Um, Even though Sanskrit is an Indo-European language and so on. It's hard to know what, so, these sites have been excavated in what is present-day Pakistan, these sites called Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Nobody has been able to decipher the language that those, the people in those sites were speaking, whether the language was a kind of Indo-European language itself, whether Dravidians were a much older Indo-European group. So it's a very mysterious kind of history. But of course, these debates have been politicized and, used in many different ways. The myth of Aryan kind of this sort of Aryan purity and so on was politicized and deployed in a very dangerous way in Western Europe in the early 20th century, and it's been misused in similar ways in South Asia as well. And these are just theories that go far back, so it's hard to actually make sense of that. But thank you for the question. It's a really fascinating topic.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have Denny with the next question.
Excuse me, I needed to unmute. You're probably very familiar with the paramount status of self in American culture. I mean, we worship the self almost, in comparison to other cultures. I like the connection you made between change and impermanence to get people to realize there is a non-self. My question to you is, it would be nice if we could make everybody Buddhist in America, but it isn't going to happen. And I'm curious how you might be able to make an argument in a secular way to get people to realize that there is a non-self, other than, going the Buddhist philosophy route. I like the idea of change, that's an inroad to that. Anything else?
I think, we do understand interdependence, and we are coming to understand interdependence, through globalization, through the way in which the whole world today is affected by this pandemic that we're dealing with. I think, people are realizing in really profound ways that we are interdependent, and there is no sense of I that can be separated from these other broader, social, physical, material kinds of aspects of our environment. And I feel probing the idea of interdependence is really is going to lead people to understand selflessness and relationality in a better way. And I think that's going to be, in the long term, in the long run, very beneficial for humanity, for us to really think about how there cannot be a self-contained self or person that's disconnected from, everyone else and everything else. So maybe thinking about interdependence on this very mundane level can be a first step for us to think about interdependence and emptiness in a more kind of profound and a more, deep way, I think.
While we're waiting for other questions, I do have a question myself, and that is, when you had on your slide the Dharma definitions, you listed more than what I've seen before. I'm familiar with either the capital D or lowercase d Dharma definitions, capital D being the teachings of the Buddha, and the lower d then referring to everything that exists. That is my understanding of it. So in the definitions that you gave, is that the literal translation? Is it still the case for Dharma as you know it, regardless if it's capital D or lowercase d? Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because that was different than what I'm familiar, what I've heard before. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Dharma has a very, it's such an important term, and it's been used in so many ways over, hundreds and hundreds of years of philosophical reflection and inquiry, that it's gained a particular kind of elasticity. So it can refer to, your sort of moral, your sense of righteousness. It also can refer to, kind of a legal system. It refers to the teachings of learned people. And as you said, the quality of things in the universe, the dharma of the sun to shine is that kind of meaning. There are many such words in Sanskrit languages, in Sanskrit texts, and also non-Sanskrit traditions, so in Pali and in other languages, that defy translation into a single English term. They have a kind of elasticity and an applicability that goes beyond a single English language term, which makes translation quite tricky, because you have to really think about the context that you're translating from and that you're translating into. And it also makes commentary really important. The commentarial tradition that surrounds texts becomes really important. That's part of the oral tradition of Hinduism that I alluded to earlier, that there's an emphasis on speech and on passing knowledge down from person to person. In the course of doing that, you comment on the text and you contextualize the meaning of a term like dharma or karma or moksha. All of these terms have many different meanings in different intellectual contexts. So the commentary becomes really important. The text or the sutras that you read, in and of themselves, they're really, they're prelude to elaboration through commentary, and elaboration by a teacher who's well qualified and who's studied and who can tell you, in this case, dharma means this, and in this text, dharma means that. And that's why an important teacher is so important.
Thank you for that clarification and that explanation. We have Charles with the next question, please.
Hi, I'm Charles. I have a question regarding the common language used during ancient Indian times, because you mentioned the language Sanskrit, but for instance, in the Theravada Buddhism, the sutta is basically written in the Pali form. Yes. So I wonder if there are regions of Indians that use mostly Sanskrit, or the other. I mean, thanks for the explanation.
Thank you for that. Nice to meet you. So Pali is as you mentioned, it's a really important language. It's related to Sanskrit, but it's not. So it's there were many regional languages that were related to Sanskrit, but also they developed their own forms of grammar, their own literature, their own, and modern Indian languages, there are probably 27, 28 official languages, Most of them are connected to Sanskrit in some way, but you know, um, they they've taken on a life that goes beyond Sanskrit, and Pali is one of those languages. It isn't spoken commonly in contemporary India, though its effects are felt deeply, and it's left an imprint on other regional languages. Uh, Sanskrit is also not spoken by people, you know, in everyday life. Very few people actually study and speak and work with Sanskrit today. Um, it's similar to the way Latin is thought of, or ancient Greek exists in modern Europe. So you have all these languages that are connected to Latin, that came out of Latin, including English, but they're very different. They've taken on a life of their own. So Sanskrit is, you know, is similar in that way. People don't really speak it, you know, commonly, but it was a very important language in the history and development of Hinduism, but also Buddhism, as was Pali.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Everyone, if we can please join your hands and let's say thank you to our lecturer for today. Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture that you prepared for us and your first time doing Zoom. You did wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for the questions that were provided for today. I do have a few announcements for everyone, if you can allow me. And that is our next TBIF will be on Friday, August 28th. The topic will be Humanistic Buddhism and the Four Immeasurables, a compassionate guide for societal challenges. Excuse me. Our speaker is the lovely Miss Aina Denton. She's a Bilia Lay Dharma lecturer, and she's actually here with us today on this phone call. And the second announcement is, if you are interested in joining our Sifang Temple's online Dharma classes, they will start on August 15th. The reference book we'll be using for that class will be Buddha Dharma, Pure and Simple by Venerable Master Hsing Yun. This book was released last summer, and there will be an electronic copy of the book available for students enrolled. So just go to our website or to the email that was sent to you all, and you can link there directly. Also, there was a question if we can share today's slides. We will ask our honorable speaker if he can share them, and then I will send an email to everybody for doing that. Okay. Now, I thank you all for allowing us to go a few minutes over. Now, the very last thing that we'd like to do is preserve this moment in time. So if you're not showing your lovely face, if you can show your video. And Sifang Temple will be taking a picture of us all on this phone call. And I'll give it to Venerable Miao Zhang to say some last words. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to facilitate for today.
Thank you. So thank you, Aftab, Dr. Tassal, for the wonderful presentation. And for our record, maybe we can do a good photo by screenshots. So everyone, please turn on your video and then let us do a lotus gesture like that. And remember to smile.